History Center this morning. Very happy to gather with you here for a second Saturday program. I just have a couple of announcements before we get started here. Upcoming programs, March 12th at 10 o'clock is our March 2nd Saturday program. We're doing First Females in Berks County, past and present. The Women's History Alliance will continue in Suffrage 2020 Centennial Celebration. They're going to have a panel discussion of Berks County women who were the first in their occupational fields. And afterwards, there's going to be guided tours of the museum. So you've been through the museum before. Going through with one of our guides is a very different experience, so I highly recommend that. On March 26th from 9 to 2, we're doing Krista's Oval Basket Workshop, and that's going to be led by our education curator, Vicki Hefner. She's going to teach everybody weaving and a one-of-a-kind basket using quarter-inch flat oval reeds and seagrass, along with a hand-woven handle. And all best baskets have a woven handle a little bit. Tickets for that are $45 for members and $55 for non-members. So if you're not a member of the Berks History Center, that's okay, we're not mad, but we can fix that for you out in the lobby before you leave today. So if you see at least the front desk, if you'd like to join, and one of the best benefits you'll get from that is our historical review. The historical review of Berks County is our quarterly magazine. It's been in continuous publication since 1935. It's an outstanding publication, and if you're not getting it, you are missing out. And we have samples of that if you'd like to see what it's all about out in the lobby in the gift shop. So check it out. It's a great benefit in addition to just being a part of all we have going on here at the Berks History Center. I'm glad you're all here today, so you clearly saw the announcement for this program. But if you're following us on social media, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, you'll be up to date on all the latest things that come in. Sometimes we have programs that will pop up in between the mailings that we're able to do through the Postal Service. Check them out there, and you'll be all up to date. You can also go to our website, berkshistory.org, and find all the latest things going on here. You can look at us on YouTube as well. A lot of the programs that we have, we record, we release them on YouTube. So if there's a Saturday where you were jammed up, couldn't get here, check us out on YouTube. We usually have them up a week or two after the program, and you can see what you missed there. So with that, we're going to get to our main event. So today we have with us two gentlemen here to talk about Back from the Battle, the forgotten story of Pennsylvania's Camp Discharge, and weary Civil War soldiers get served. And so we have Jim Remsen here with us. He is a journalist and author of 3 books, Intermarriage Handbook, Visions of Tioga, and A Battle of Freedom. And since retiring as a religion editor from the Philadelphia Inquirer, Jim has pursued his keen interest in history, and he especially focuses in on our nation's local history. And we also have with us Brad Upp, and he's a member of the Lower Merion Historical Society, and he's a former educator. And he grew up near Camp Discharge and has stoked a fascination with history and led him to become a Civil War historian. He's a relic hunter, a reenactor representing the 69th Pennsylvania Infantry, and he's a skilled collector of artifacts from various periods of history, and he has a passion like this for a myriad of locations throughout the United States. We're very lucky to have them with us this morning. I hope you help me welcome to the podium. Come on up here, guys, and get us started.
Thanks, Man. Thank you all for coming and having us today. I'm going to try and stay still. I normally pace around, but it was asked because there's a film of this to remain stationary, which I will try to do. Because I get very excited about talking about this particular subject, Civil War history, American history. Again, I'm Brad Upp. I am the co-author with Jim Remsen on the book Back from Battle. We can jump right into it. This is, anybody who's headed into Philadelphia on the Schuylkill Expressway. Is this safe? Come on. All right. It's not working. But you look just above that house, those houses, and below that camp right up there, that's where the Schuylkill Expressway is. Conshohocken's over here, Philadelphia's that way. This is about 11 miles outside of Center City. And this is the only known photograph of Camp Discharge. I grew up, see those houses there, just up on the ridge above that place. So I used to play over in that field with the other kids on the street, having no idea that it was actually the Camp Discharge location. I did read about Camp Discharge in 1979 in the Mainline Times. I was 10 years old. I thought it was really interesting. I still had no idea where it was because the person who wrote the article just basically covered the entire County curve. So again, little information, not a whole lot. This was buried in the Historical Society of Pennsylvania on Locust Street. When we started this process of putting together I'm with the Lower Merion Historical Society, and this project began to get some momentum a number of years ago. So I was on the search for anything on information. And any of you that have ever done historical research know that a lot of stuff doesn't just jump off the page into your lap. Already, like someone's got to collect it, and generally speaking, on a subject matter that's not Gettysburg, not a big battle. This is the demobilization of the Union Army, portion of the demobilization of the Union Army. So it's a small footnote, yet very relevant. So this is a higher definition image of Camp Discharge. This is the same picture. And I should say, when I went down to Philadelphia to look for this thing, it was all a comedy of errors. It was random. You know, there's a Civil War guy who comes up from the University of Virginia once a month. He happened to be there that day. I told him about this. He said, okay, let's go look in the card catalog. He's like, there's a picture of this place. I was shocked. And needless to say, I filled out the paperwork, waited for the picture, and the intern brought down a picture from basically from Fort Douglas in Illinois. And I said, this is it. I think this is it. So he's like, well, that's all it is. And so I was kind of moping around, and the Civil War guy was like, did you see the picture? And I said, actually, no, unfortunately. He's like, hold on. He pulled his glasses off, he walked over, he sent this guy back upstairs. He's like, I want you to search in all the bins around the bin that you found this in. And sure enough, that was misfiled in 1905, and nobody had been looking for it until now. So fortunately, we have an image. Many people thought that this was just a couple of tents up on a hill. Some thought it was a prison camp. Again, this was word of mouth. The material was written down but dispersed into little pockets where if you've ever gone on like Google or YouTube, like you get into like this vortex, and like an hour and a half later you've bounced around to 100 different places. So at the end of the day, we can see that this is a going concern. This was built in the late 4th. Oh, by the way, we're going to do our talk today for about a half hour. Then we're going to open up for questions. And then we'll have some books around the corner. So I should mention that at the beginning. I forgot. But we have 2-story barracks. This property was leased from a gentleman who was had a local farm there. And his name is Joseph Kirkner. 1851 map of Lower Merion shows his quadrant on this hillside. This is currently owned by the Philadelphia Country Club, the very prestigious Philadelphia Country Club, who has allowed me in the winter months. I'm not currently a member. I don't know if that's actually ever going to happen, but they allow me to come there from January to April 15th when the golf season opens. So I've been excavating for the last couple of winters, and there are some artifacts back on the table around the corner that have been revealed over time. And so this place was surrounded by a 12-foot fence. I guess this little pointer just doesn't want to come. Oh, there it is. Here's the exterior fence. There's just a little piece. Here's the interior fence, 12 feet high, 2-story barracks. It was a quadrangle, officers' quarters at the top, 100-foot flagpole, all the familiar symptoms of a stationary camp, lake fort. Here are the blueprints. Another well-hidden artifact at the National Archives down in Washington, D.C., where the Historical Society of Bavarian sent Jim and I on 3 different trips, which I loved. I had the time of my life on these trips. We were looking for different items that were they're there, but you've got to find them. Research is always the key. Jim found the medical records, which he'll talk about, which is an exceptional find. We did a lot of the pensions and different records, enlistment records of the soldiers that are in the book, and also were up there. But this was a college park in the annex building, far, far away from, about 40 minutes away from the National Archives building. So we were in the small cafe in the basement of the archives. And I looked everywhere for the blueprints. The blueprints had been mentioned when all the camp buildings were auctioned off in December of 1865. They also noted that there were 3 bidders. I'm in the construction industry. You always get 3 bids, same style in 1864 when they built this place. And they said that, and I looked at the Athenaeum, which is a great architectural building. It has many collections of very notable architects in Philadelphia. This was designed by John MacArthur Jr., who designed City Hall. It would be his most notable design. But we were in the cafe. I'm lamenting the fact that I was like, the blueprints, who knows where those things are? And the guy overheard us and said, he was a hired researcher. He said, listen, there's a land holdings and, basically architectural information at the annex in College Park. And I said, really? And he said, sure. In the morning, the shuttle runs like every hour from in front of the archives. Next morning, I was on the first shuttle, bounced our way over there. This thing was like about to fall apart, but I couldn't wait to get there. I walk into this room, twice the size of this room, with ring binders encircling the entire place. And I guess there's some information in here somewhere. And a very helpful woman came up to me. She said, well, are you looking for something specifically? And I was like, yes. It's a small discharge camp. It's called Camp Discharge. I don't know. And she said, okay, so it would have been an installment port. And I was like, well, it was a discharge facility. But yes, it was a port of sorts. She walks over and grabs this blue binder, which looked like the other 2,000 binders, ripped it out of the wall, pulled it open. She said, okay, come back in an hour, and I'll have the blueprints here. My knees buckled. I was like, come on, you've got to be kidding. It was thrilling. So I come back, and the lady comes in who pulled the records in these giant gray folders. She's like, this is the most interesting thing I've pulled all month. Throws it open, and this is on white muslin cloth. And this is the design. This is basically, these aren't the as-builts, because there's a couple of adjustments that had to be made. That ridge was not very agreeable to build all these buildings exactly the same way. But it's very close to what is happening. The 4th fairway of the Centennial 9 course, built in 1991, wish I'd been in there before that. But I was in the 70s when it was an apple orchard. But the 4th fairway comes right along here, and the green is right there. So this lower third is what I've been working with. Here's the Schuylkill River down here. It's the Reading Railroad, and River Road that ran from basically the Conshohocken area in Philadelphia. And so you have, and by the way, all on the inside here, they had a water system. They thought that there would be plenty of water when they did the survey in the spring, because there was a bold rushing brook. There were some springs, but by the time the summer rolls around, there's no water, and they're getting close to the fall when they're opening this place. So they actually had to let's just put it this way. The camp was supposed to cost $61,000. By the end, it had cost a whopping 200 grand. We see this sometimes with government funds. It happens. It's grossly made a mistake. But they built an engine there's this creek over here. And they built an engine to churn that water up and put it into these, they're not featured here, but they're somewhere around here, but there were these big, like basically barrels, 12,000 gallons. And then they ran like a hose system around the inside of the camp so there'd be waters and spigots. Very state-of-the-art for 1864. Here's a better picture. There's the Schuylkill Expressway. Here we go. Philadelphia's over here. And I grew up down here on Lafayette Road, so you can imagine, so we used to run and play around up here. This is all Philadelphia Country Club, except for this little neighborhood. And Conshohocken up here. Oh, I'm sorry, I went a little far. This is the only known surviving structure from Camp Discharge. This is the Sentinel box that sat at the main entrance. So a guy would sit in there at the main gate, people coming in, people going out. This is, if you've ever heard of Allen Wood Steel, which is in Conshohocken, Howard Wood bought all this property in the 1880s and basically built his home, which he called Camp Discharge. And this is at the base of what was once his driveway. It's at Century Lane, appropriately named. And the people that live on Century Lane maintain this little building. Like I said, this is a tin and lead and zinc roof. We have this, these pine board, actually it's a different type of wood, but that yellow ochre is the color of all the camp materials. So, this is the last remaining artifact. It's basically right across the street from the Riverbend Environmental Center in Gladwin in Lower Township, and can be seen today, which is basically, it sits right there. It was probably originally like right over here. I moved over there. So anyway, my esteemed colleague is going to take over and give you some more in-depth perspectives.
Hey, good morning, folks. Brad will be back to talk a little bit about his work and recovering artifacts there. It's wonderful what he's done, and you'll be interested in hearing about that. I wanted to talk a bit about who were the soldiers who were there, and why was the camp even built in the first place. So maybe some of you recognize this picture. If you're a Civil War buff, maybe you've heard of Pickett's Charge, high water mark of the Confederacy, bloody angle where the Union forces boarded the Pickett's Charge. That's what you're seeing here at the stone wall. So you have the Union forces on the left and the Confederates fighting it out in hand-to-hand combat on the right. A number of men who went to Camp Discharge had been at Gettysburg, had been right there at the bloody angle, that was called. The men who had gone to camp had been assigned to go to Camp Discharge for their processing out of their regiments, had been in the thick of combat for years. Every battle you can think of, they were in. From Bull Run to Fredericksburg, Antietam, Gettysburg, Petersburg. Some were even in the March to the Sea, battles down around Nashville. They had been through the thick of it. And so this camp, as we mentioned, didn't exist until 1864. The Army suddenly decided they needed a camp like this. And they ordered it assembled quite rapidly, again, on the edge of Philadelphia. Because a lot of these soldiers had enlisted as volunteers in 1861 when the war broke out for 3-year enlistments. And so their discharge dates were either overdue or coming due. So there was great expectation to get these men processed out. They had agreed to give 3 years of their lives and had given their pound of flesh and more. Most of them wanted out. Some of them did re-up and would be assigned to other regiments. A lot of their regiments were being dissolved and being absorbed into other regiments. And their families wanted them home. They wanted to be home. The Army was getting reinforcements, and so they wanted to honor their contract and get these men out. They were called 3-year men. Most of the men who went to Camp Discharge have been 3-year men. Some were 2-year men, again, they signed up a little bit later. Toward the end, even 1-year men, when it was a stampede to demobilize the Army. But that's an idea of just who went there. They represented 89, they had men from 89 regiments. They were all Pennsylvania volunteers. Most of them were infantry. There were some cavalry and some artillery, but the vast majority of them were infantry. They were, the way the Army structured itself, you know, these were men who were Pennsylvania volunteers, but they were federalized into the Union Army, and the Army set up jurisdictions. And this is important to understand about Camp Discharge. So Camp Discharge served the eastern district of the eastern jurisdiction of Pennsylvania militarily. And it meant that if you had trained and mustered in one of the eastern Pennsylvania camps, you needed to then be mustered out administratively the same way. So if you had come back north and arrived in Pittsburgh, say, you couldn't muster out there. They would ship you to the east to be mustered out properly. And so these were, again, all men from eastern Pennsylvania regiments. Camp Discharge was set up to handle a fragment of them. It was not big enough to handle all of the Pennsylvania soldiers. It was set up to handle folks who had been separated from their regiments. It was a specialty camp, you might say. Most of the regiments the men had stuck together, and they would be processed out in a somewhat orderly fashion and be taken off the field, have a mustering out ceremony, be sent back to their home jurisdiction to be officially and finally discharged out of their regiment. Meaning that's where they get their final pay, they work out if they owed anything or not, if they were a bounty or a bonus, they would be, that would all be taken care of. And decide if they wanted to buy their weapon, they could do that. All that was worked out at the discharge point, it would be called the rendezvous point in Pennsylvania. And so, again, eastern Pennsylvania. But the problem was not every soldier in the chaos of war was still with their regiment at that point in time. Most of them were, unless they were killed. But there were 3 general circumstances that would lead to a man who would instead have to come to Camp Discharge. They had been separated from their regiment because they were sent on what was called detached duty. Another regiment needed someone with their skills or just needed some reinforcements. They would be shipped over to another regiment and be assigned there. They still belonged to their original regiment administratively and their paperwork, but they would be sent off elsewhere. And then as time went on, you know, they might be going this way and their original regiment was going that way. Their regiment stayed together, went through that process. Meanwhile, they were stranded over here. So they would, once they made their way north, they would be, as a straggler, you might say, they would be sent up to Camp Discharge. Another category of men who was separated were ones who were wounded or had been contracted some illness down south during the time of fighting. They would have been sent off to a hospital or somewhere to recover. And meanwhile, the rest of the regiment's going off here. They're spending a couple of weeks there. Often in Union-held territory down south, the Union Army had networks of hospitals and medical facilities. We know around Nashville, there was a complex around Memphis. I know they were there as well. Just to give you an idea. So by the time they were well enough to make their way north, God knows where the rest of the regiment was. They would make their way to be sent to Philly, and then these men would go to the adjutant's office in Center City, explain their situation, get a train pass, take that Reading line, as you saw, that's along the river, to Camp Discharge, and make their way up the hill, be assigned to a barracks, and wait. And the big third category of men who had been separated were POWs. 4 in 10 of the men who went to Camp Discharge had been imprisoned. 3 in 10 of them had been in Andersonville, that hellhole that was very notorious in time. 331 of the men. We were able to piece together a roster of the men who had gone there. There were about 1,100 of them, and 331 of them had survived in Andersonville, had gone through who knows what, and seen their comrades, die, just suffer horribly in Andersonville. So those 3 categories: the detached duty, the people who were injured or ill, and the Andersonville folks. Again, toward the end of the war, making their way north and sent up there. This is one of the roster sheets, another one of our finds down. Now a lot of this is online, but originally it is down at the National Archives. And so the clerks at Camp Discharge would keep records of the men as they came in and get their, obviously their name, but also their regiment and their company and the date that they arrived. So one of our challenges was to decipher these lists. It's all handwritten by several clerks over time, taken probably phonetically. If someone was an immigrant with an unusual spelling, it would just be spelled out phonetically, and we would have to match that up to the official records of best we could tell that regiment and figure out who that person was. This is a blown up part of it at the bottom because several of the men who we focused on are listed down here. But that was quite a task. And half of the book, by the way, is that roster of these men and their military service and anything else we can learn about their life and whereabouts leading up to the wartime. And again, Andersonville, just to give you a picture of that. This is a photo of then crowding at the front gate in Andersonville, which is an open-air POW camp in southern Georgia, where the water was the sewer too, and rampant diseases, skin infections, eye problems from the smoke, and horrible crowding. Men would go crazy there and just fall down in the mud and just give up and die. There are a lot of heart-rending stories about them. This man over on the right, his name is Philip Hatfill. He was from White Marsh, outside Philly. He didn't make it to Camp Discharge. He didn't survive making his way home. He went to, the men from Andersonville, by and large, would make their way north. A lot of them went to the coast in Carolina, would just have to make their way across. Someone up the Mississippi. There were different ways to flare their way north. But a lot of the men would be directed, the first stop to get some medical care would be at Annapolis, Maryland. So the ships would bring them up to the port at Annapolis, and there was a military hospital complex there. That's when this picture of Philip Hatfill was taken. He died soon after, but just to give you an idea of how skeletal the worst of these cases were. It's really rough stuff to read about. And we were able to come upon a number of memoirs of men who had been at camp, had been in Andersonville, and then later at Camp Discharge to really add some detail about the difficulties of those men. So that's probably one of the reasons that Camp Discharge was located in this somewhat remote location, on a hillside, a remote hillside, 11 miles outside of downtown Philly. In a way, it was a quarantine camp, you might say. It was a place for these men to go. There were a couple of hospital, they call them hospital buildings. They were more like infirmaries, you might say now, to help these men while they waited for their paperwork to be tracked down. That was what would happen. So they would be sent to these somewhat, weatherized barracks, not in open tents, or they would be admitted to the hospital. A lot of them were outpatients. They would go and get their treatment and then go back to the barracks and just try to nurse themselves back to health. So again, they would have reported down to downtown Philly, to the adjutant's office, a mustering office, and identified themselves, then sent up to Camp Discharge, where they would sign in, be assigned to a barracks, and make the best of life like, well, they waited, because then the adjutant's challenge was to figure out these men's cases, to track down where the heck the regimental officers were who had the paperwork for these men. And, you know, there was no texting. None of the things we could do now to get the answer in 5 minutes. They would find where the paperwork for these men was, and figure out, yes, they had not been with the regiment since they were captured at the wilderness or somewhere. And the dates matched up. And here's how much they were owed. Here's any other circumstance of their case. And that would then be shuttled to Philly, and their paymaster would figure out what they were owed. They would have someone come up on the train, summon that man to headquarters, and, you know, everything would be taken care of with that man, and he would be then given the train pass on the Reading to make his way closer to home. 2/3 of the regiments that had men at Camp Discharge were Philadelphia, who had done a lot of their recruiting in Philadelphia. So these men, while they're sitting there waiting for this final step of their paperwork, they didn't really want to be there. Also because they were maybe 5 to 10 miles from home, right? They could get overnight passes, and it seems like a number of the men would make their way back and visit their families, but they had to come back and be there back at the camp for the morning roll call. Or they could be, they were able, and they could be thrown into the brig. I'll show you a picture of the brig a little bit later. But the commandant there had a problem with AWOL men, and he had to crack down on that. So again, I mentioned that there were 2 hospital buildings among the barracks there, and the man up top there you're seeing was a man named Joseph Corson. One of the early Quaker settler families in that area with the Corsons, and a string of generations of doctors in the Corson clan. And this is Joseph Corson, who actually distinguished himself in battle, and his time was up. He got out of the military, went back to work for his father, also a doctor, and but then he decided to become a contract surgeon back working for the military. He was assigned to the Camp Discharge hospitals, and we read his memoir, and he talks about what bad shape a lot of these men were in. What you're looking at there is a page from what's called the prescription book, and that would be where the other page you're not seeing is the name of the man and his condition, and then over here is a page of the treatment that was prescribed for the man in the prescription book. So it could be then handed on to the person in charge for the next shift and the next day, so they knew what kind of treatment the men were getting. And they were really a lot of horrible medical conditions for the men. Smallpox, typhoid, tuberculosis, malaria, dysentery, scurvy, a lot of skin infections, and these men were, a lot of them in really bad shape. Some by the time they got up to Camp Discharge were in recovery from them, but others were sick. We know a few men died at Camp Discharge. We haven't been able to determine where they were buried and what was done. But the treatment at the time, medical care, was pretty primitive. In Europe, there was something called the germ theory of disease, which was how disease like that spread. That hadn't taken hold in the U.S. yet. It was known, but it wasn't. We were still in the last stages of what we believed was the miasmatic theory, that there was bad air, miasma, and that's how diseases were spreading. And the treatment that was given to men often was either too much or too little, too intense or too little. There was a lot of treatments would have mercury in them. Mercury's a poison. Mercury would be in there. They would try to kind of shock the system and alter the course. It was called alteratives. It would alter the course of the disease. There was mercury. There was arsenic in some of the treatments. Opium, of course, men would be getting addicted. Or there were very mild treatments that might have eased it, but not really cured, like oatmeal and other kinds of mild treatment. So it was a rough time. It was touch and go with a lot of these men, who again were young. They were men in the prime of life, and very sick. That man on the bottom, the fellow, I should say, on the bottom, the drummer boy, he was, I have him there because he's also representative of another common ailment that brought the men there, which was venereal disease. He was with a unit that had been in Philadelphia where there was a lot of camp followers and, ladies of the night. And so that probably was another reason they put the Camp Discharge in a somewhat remote location to get away from the temptations of the city, the bars at the corner and the women. By the way, I have many, many images that I took at the National Archives of these medical records. If there's anybody here who has an interest, who's a doctor or a medical person, or has an interest, I'm happy to share these if they want to drill down into this and do some research of their own, because these are precious records. So this is just representative of what was probably the everyday routine at the camp. These are not pictures taken at Camp Discharge. Unfortunately, we only have that one that Brad showed you earlier. But this is what would happen in the parade ground in the middle. This is a parade drill. And the commandant of the camp, that fellow you're seeing on the bottom, whose name was John Hancock, believe it or not. Yeah. John Hancock was the kid brother of someone whose name maybe will ring a bell. Winfield Scott Hancock, who's a famous general in the Union Army. He's from Norristown. Hancock was from Norristown. So John's his kid brother. John distinguished himself in combat and was promoted, breveted by the time he got to Camp Discharge. He was a colonel. And he angled to get the assignment to Camp Discharge. He brought his family up there. There was a farmhouse down the hillside within the perimeter of the camp. And he brought his wife and daughters up there to live there, which ruffled the higher ups a little bit, but he did. And he fancied up the camp a bit. He had a band tent. He hired a band to come play. He arranged to have an excursion train come up on Sundays where he wanted to have fancy dress parades. It fizzled, and they canceled the train. And he spent a lot of time all the way through the life of the camp trying to level out his parade ground, because it was very uneven terrain up there. Now, the golf course would like that kind of uneven terrain, but it didn't work for his purposes. So he would bring up horses and soldiers, and they would be assigned, and locals be assigned to try to grade the parade ground. So that's John Hancock, and he got into some tangles with the higher-ups and also with some of the officers in his command that we have the records, and we read about that in the book. So again, it was a lot of downtime. Men could be there for months, certainly weeks. You were lucky if you got out probably within a month because of all this tracking down the paperwork. This is again not from Camp Discharge, just to give you an idea of it. Playing cards, killing time, boozing. And there's a brig, there's a guardhouse where they would throw men if they were AWOL, just to make a statement by the commandant. So the camp was at the peak of operation as the war was ending, according to the records that we saw of the pace of men coming in. So you probably remember Appomattox in April of '65. That was the official end of the war. So the fighting went on for a little bit longer, but it basically was over by the end of April. The prisons, there had been prisoner exchanges had been resumed, and the prison doors were opening, and the Confederates were sending POWs out to their own fate. So the place was very busy in spring of '65, but it had a challenge because there was pressure from the public and from the military higher-ups and in Washington to the war's over, to bring down expenses, bring down the size of the army. Families wanted their men back. Some of the men went on to re-up elsewhere, but between May and Thanksgiving of 65, the Union Army went from 1 million men to 200,000 men. So it was a stampede of getting out. So the military it was a challenge for them to keep their capacity, their ability to process these men out, while also getting pressure to cut costs and close places. They were closing hospitals. They were auctioning off a lot of gear. We were auctioning horses and mules and supplies, and places like Camp Discharge. So on the left is an inventory. They had people come up and inventory everything at the camp, right down to the nails and shingles, and to prepare for an auction of the contents of the camp. And that's where you're seeing a notice with a highlight of what was for sale. And was it December or January? I don't know.
December 28th.
December 28th, right at the tail end of 65, they had this auction period where bidders could come up and they had could assess what they wanted, put in their bid. They had 2 weeks, I believe.
20 days.
20 days, thank you for that, to remove the things they're buying off the camp. And that happened. But you see one of the things up there is the sentry box. Horse trough, bench, or 116,000 feet of floorboards, on and on. And it was a successful auction. We know that some of the operators of the mills up in Conshohocken came and they bought a lot of the buildings and moved them up either as worker housing for their workers or incorporated into the mills. And there you're seeing over on the right a mill called Balabomingo Mills that was down there. And they bought that landmark flagpole that you saw earlier on and put it on the premises. And there, sure enough, is a print of it done in the 1870s with the flagpole, which was there until a few years after this was done because there was a fire there, and among the things that burned was the flagpole. But if you know what if you should know what you're looking for, you might find in some of the buildings still around Conshohocken and West Conshohocken a wall or something that was built with the Camp Discharge wood. The only thing we know for sure is that sentry box. So that is the physical story of Camp Discharge. A big part of what we did too was tracing the lives of the men who went there, the everyday soldiers, and some of the officers as well. And this is 3 of them, just to tell you a little bit about them. And we have in the book 16 of the men profiled to some degree from our research on them. This man with the haunted eyes on the right is Isaac Horner. And so we pulled his pension file. Brad actually was the one that opened his, again, the National Archives. It comes in a manila folder, and it's all pension paperwork is a gold mine because it's got the affidavits of the doctor, of the employer, of the spouse, of the neighbors, about that man and what kind of condition he was in. And so in extra bonus in Isaac Horner's was some photos of him. This is one of them. And a little diary, a little pocket diary that included his time at Andersonville. Amazing. And then the other, and letters as well. So Isaac Horner went back to his family. He had a family that he left to go fight. And he came back, by then they were in Camden. And he lived with them for a couple of years. And then he abandoned his family. He just took off, let it be known, don't try to find me. And he went off to Ohio, where he was taken in by another family as an employer, caring for the older folks in that family, but abandoned his original family, never got back in touch with them. This new family didn't even know about that family until the man Isaac Horner died, and they went through his effects and saw, oh my God, he had a family. So they reached out to the Camden widow, who did not know she was a widow, to inform her and swap pictures of him as well, and be in touch and care for her. So they talked about getting together. meet each other. We don't know what they did, but it was a kind thing, you know, for the Ohio family to do. But just an idea of how some of these men became restless and just, you know, were not settled in their lives. It was hard to move back into their old lives. The man in the middle, a young fellow, he's Edward Swisher, and he was at Andersonville, got scurvy, it was called bone scurvy, from vitamin deficiency, to where teeth were falling out, and he, you know, was drooling, and horrible. He went back, tried to make a life here, and then went out to the oil fields up in northwestern PA, and there are accounts of just how much he suffered and died young. A lot of these men died young. Albert Thalheimer, you're seeing on the left. I don't know if that name rings a bell with any of you, but he came and made his fortune after the war here in Reading. Yeah, he's one of the ones. I'm going to read you his story briefly. You should be proud of Albert Thalheimer. He also was in Andersonville. Let me just read you her bio on Albert. Some former prisoners of war, at least those who managed to regain their health and their footing, seemed to burn with purpose. Albert Thalheimer was one of them. His German Jewish family had brought him to the United States as a boy, leaving the murderous anti-Semitism of the old country behind, and they settled in Philadelphia. In July 1861, when he was 19, Thalheimer joined the 23rd Pennsylvania Infantry, the colorful Birdies and Zouaves. 3 years later, he fell into rebel hands at the Battle of Cold Harbor, Virginia. 9 months of privation at Andersonville followed, during which he lost nearly 100 pounds. He began to recuperate at a Union hospital in Vicksburg, then spent 3 weeks at Camp Discharge before returning to his family, still in Philadelphia. From there, a renewed Thalheimer migrated to Reading to establish himself as an entrepreneur. He opened a dancing school first, then an organ factory, and the breakthrough came when he set up a business manufacturing cigar boxes. That brought wealth and prestige, plus seats on Reading's Board of Trade and Chamber of Commerce. But Thalheimer never lost touch with fellow veterans. Newspapers reported his leadership in the local Andersonville Survivors Association and his hiring of a half dozen aging or disabled Civil War vets for light work at his factory, a number that grew to 50 men. He lobbied senators on behalf of an 1890 bill broadening veterans' pension rights, saying that, quote, he himself is not dependent on the bill, but he speaks for many who are. Further, he offered his GAR post, GAR, Grand Army of the Republic, but the VFW, he offered his GAR post attractive land and the stones to erect a soldier's monument on the western slope of Mount Penn. And he donated another tract to house what was called an old man's home. Thalheimer retired in 1911, and he died 12 years later at age 81. His obituary in the Reading Times lauded him as one of the city's public-spirited citizens. So he's what you might call a success story, and inspiring. He's gone on to do well, but always had a heart for his fellow veterans and what they were still going through. So a good guy, and you know, I'm going to do some more research on him. I couldn't determine whether the old man's home was built, or is there a soldier's monument at Mount Penn? But he was the origin of that. So let me bring my colleague back up, and he can explain who that fellow is and what the heck he's doing in the hole.
So I should just say that I got interested in the Civil War technically when I read the article in 1979, but then that faded quickly. And then again in 9th grade, I read my great-great-great-grandfather's Civil War diary. He was from Pike County, he was Dutch, and then I had some other German family members where up comes from that all started in Pennsylvania but migrated west to the Great Western Expansion. So I read this diary, and I was in 9th grade, and I was like, wow, this is so cool. Then sports, girls, out the window. I mean, no one was talking about it. I mean, we had to do it in school, but it wasn't like a real push to pursue that. So it wasn't until years later that I got back into this family genealogy. I found a bunch of guys from York, Ohio, Illinois, but many of them started like in Pike County, Philadelphia, and then moved around. But one other great-great-great-grandfather survived Andersonville, or I wouldn't be standing here. He was with the 16th Illinois Cavalry. This all started to build in the early 90s, and I was dating a girl in Richmond, and I would make this trip down 95, and I started to see these Civil War sites. It's like, wow. I was like, I know something happened here. This wasn't like when my parents took my brother and I to Gettysburg. We were like 7 and 8 years old, and we were like, come on. It's funny how you look back, and this is all consuming now. Like, I'm still working on the Camp Discharge project every day in some capacity. This is an ongoing study. So, but I bought my first metal detector in 1994 in Richmond. I went to Fredericksburg on the way home from Richmond, and I was in a nice set of dress clothes. We'd gone out to lunch. I show up at an artifact store. There was a bunch of them in Fredericksburg in the 90s. And I asked the guy, I was like, where can I go metal detecting? He's like, we don't normally tell. It's like a fishing spot. We don't really tell you where to go. But he looked at me, and you can see that I had a collared shirt on and like slacks. He's like, all right, if you go across the Rappahannock River, they're clearing out this hillside where a few Connecticut companies were camped right before the Battle of Fredericksburg. So I go over there, I pull in, and there's a bunch of guys in camo and all the stuff. And I get out of my car, and they're like, we already have permission to be here. They thought I was like the guy. I was like, no. I was like, I'm in a metal detector. And they're like, in that outfit? And I was like, yeah. He's like, where's the shovel? And I picked the stick up. I was like, here's my shovel. So these guys made fun of me for a while. It was all food, good fun. I was like, listen, can someone just show me how to turn this thing on? and one guy did. So he said, listen, he said, this is a basic setup, just use it like this. He's like, if I had an extra shovel, I'd give you one, but I was like, I'll just use the stick, it's no big deal. So I dug a bunch of barbed wire and cans, but I found my first Civil War artifact, which is a melted bullet, which is actually quite unique, where the nose of the bullet is, and then there's this, it's just a unique, unusual find that's probably been there at campfire. I was hooked. From then on, I've been doing this for years. I spent a lot of time in Virginia, not only sleeping on the ground in the reenacting uniform, and I don't look like I was in Andersonville. I look like a soldier with a thyroid problem, but it's okay, But I've spent more time sleeping on the ground in Virginia than anywhere else. And I've been reenacting for 25 years with the Philadelphia Brigade of 69 Pennsylvania. A lot of these guys were at Camp Discharge. Now this particular picture is one of the sinks or latrines. I have found 2 of these on the Camp Discharge property. Again, the lower third of the camp is available through the good graces of the country club. Again, from January to middle of April, I spend more time than some of the members spend the whole year there. I am a constant, but they've been very welcoming to me. Initially, they were like, wait a minute. They're the prestigious Philadelphia Country Club. Like, what if you find a dead body? I said, no, they leased this property. A couple guys did die at Camp Discharge, but they were taken to nearby cemeteries. I was like, let me assure you, they were renting this from Joseph Kirker. There's no way they were going to bury someone in his, apple orchard. I don't, So they acquiesced. They could have told me to get lost. I mean, we don't need this kind of, attention. But anyway, this hillside is rough. It's rocky. It's filled with roots. There's mineralization all over this soil, which is not good for a metal detector. It just gives you all kinds of interference. And I found the first sink by accident. And I was, one night I was digging and I was pulling near this tree, and then I saw that I lifted a rock up and the dirt fell away. And sure enough, I was in a standard latrine. I'm 6'4". These are generally 10 feet deep, 5 feet wide, 12 feet long, regulation, settled camp. And those bottles came out of the latrines. The most interesting thing I found in this latrine was an eyeglass lens. So you can picture the guy, it's late at night, he's got the lantern. Now these things are like one of those like strings of Johnny on the spots like at the Eagles game. You know, so like, you get like 7 guys in there. But he's in there, it's not a lot of room. The eyeglass bounces out, bounces around, and drops right through the hole. Never to be seen again, not until 2019. And I took it to my eye doctor, and he's like, this is an amazingly well-ground glass for a far-sighted person. And it was one of my favorite items, personal items from the camp. And so the rest of this stuff, you know, you can see basically you've got a bunch of buttons, a harmonica reed, some knapsack parts. These are shoulder scales probably worn by the 187th Pennsylvania, who came right from the Lincoln funeral procession in Philadelphia and became one of the next camp guards in May. And they probably still have the shoulder scales. Most guys showing up there probably didn't have any shoulder scales on, but they most likely did in that dress uniform. I'm speculating, but it seems likely. And in fact, one of my second favorite finds this little 5th Corps badge, like silhouette Maltese cross. And they usually put that at the top of the kepi when they started having Corps badges in 1863 to identify the different people in the different corps. But that is a very fragile, cool piece. It's in the display case. But again, you know, you have a nice wide variety of pipes, bayonets, scabbard tips, you know, things that would be indicative of this camp that was there and these people milling around. And there's nothing cooler than holding the history. And by the way, this place is awesome. All these artifacts in here, the second I walked in here, I was like, this is my kind of place. I love it. I mean, everywhere you look is something of historical interest. So, but anyway, like tomorrow, if we don't get snowed on too heavily, I'd like to be back in there. There's 2 sinks, there's got to be one more down there. There were 9 around this place. I know there's one more, and that's what I spent the last winter trying to find. And hopefully they threw a lot of trash in there. But they had the sanitary commission in the late war. They probably threw most of the stuff in the Schuylkill River. That's basically the reality, which is fine. You know, I just like being out there, and I like being able to recover and hold the history for other people to enjoy, which we're enjoying in here. Again, I'm overwhelmed, I love it. And now, we're going to take some questions.